Ilara Vance, a botanist by trade and a plant whisperer by passion, had always found solace in the quiet green world of her greenhouse. After a particularly grueling year at the university, battling budget cuts and uninspired students, she decided to pour her savings into a small, neglected property on the outskirts of town. Its main selling point wasn't the dilapidated cottage, but the sprawling, wild garden that encircled it, complete with an old, moss-covered glass greenhouse. "It's a beautiful mess," her friend Liam, an equally enthusiastic but far more cautious horticulturist, had remarked, eyeing the ancient gnarled rose bushes that seemed to claw at the cottage walls. Ilara, however, saw potential, a canvas of untamed life. The first few weeks were a joyful blur of pruning, weeding, and repotting. Ilara hummed as she worked, her hands covered in rich earth. The greenhouse in particular felt like a sacred space. She filled it with rare orchids, vibrant carnivorous plants, and delicate ferns, nurturing each one with almost obsessive care. She had always believed plants had a subtle awareness, a quiet energy, but what she experienced in the Blackwood garden was different. It started subtly, a faint, earthy scent, cloying and sweet, that clung to the air even after the greenhouse. Doors were closed. The plants seemed to grow with unusual vigor, their leaves a deeper green, their blooms impossibly vibrant. One morning she found a normally slow-growing Monstera deliciosa had unfurled 3 new enormous leaves overnight. Another time, the pitcher plants, usually lethargic, were actively snapping shut at unseen insects, a rapid, almost aggressive movement. Then came the sounds. At first, Ilara dismissed them as the wind rustling through the leaves or the old greenhouse creaking. But soon, she began to discern a distinct, low hissing, almost a whisper, emanating from the denser foliage. It was too regular, too intentional, to be wind. It sounded like a conversation, a sibilant language she couldn't quite grasp, but that hummed with a strange, unsettling energy. One evening, as dusk bled purple into the sky, Ilara was watering her prize-winning orchid. She leaned in to admire its delicate petals when a single long tendril from a nearby vine, a plant she didn't recall having tendrils, brushed against her arm. It wasn't a gentle brush. It felt like a deliberate, cold caress, leaving a strange, tingling sensation. She pulled back sharply, a prickle of unease rising. The vine remained motionless, as if innocent. Later that night, as a storm brewed outside, the house felt strangely quiet, yet the hiss from the garden seemed to penetrate the walls. Ilara lay in bed, unable to sleep, her thoughts drifting to the plants. She thought she heard a faint tapping against her window pane, not the rain, but something harder, more rhythmic. When she crept to the window, pulling back the curtain, she saw nothing but the swaying branches of the trees in the wind. But then, the large shadow of a climbing rose bush, directly outside her window, seemed to shift against the cottage wall, its thorns appearing sharper, more numerous, even in the dim light. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she thought she saw one of its thick, thorny branches move, not with the wind, but with a slow, predatory reach towards her window. A single rosebud, dark red and unnaturally large, seemed to unfurl, its petals quivering, revealing a center that looked less like a bloom and more like a tiny, watchful eye. Ilara stumbled back, her heart hammering. Her scientific mind, usually so rational, struggled to reconcile what she was witnessing. These weren't just plants. Something was happening in her garden, something ancient and deeply unsettling, and it felt like it was beginning to take notice of her. The next morning, Ilara's unease solidified into a chilling certainty. She avoided the window, but the image of the shifting rosebush and its watchful eye was seared into her mind. Her first thought was to call Liam, to share her bizarre observations, but a strange reluctance held her back. How could she explain it? She, the seasoned botanist, claiming her plants were moving with intent. Instead, she decided on a more scientific approach. Armed with her camera, a notepad, and an unshakable sense of dread, she ventured back into the greenhouse. The air inside was thick and humid, the cloying, sweet scent almost overpowering. The plants, normally a source of calm, now seemed to press in on her, a dense, silent crowd. She meticulously photographed the monstera, noting its extraordinary growth. She examined the pitcher plants, seeing the telltale shimmer of digestive fluids at the bottom of their traps, far more than usual. As she knelt to inspect the base of a particularly robust fern, she noticed something odd in the soil. Not a root, but a thin, almost hair-like filament, pulsing faintly with a dim, reddish light, weaving through the rich earth. It seemed to stretch deeper, connecting with other similar filaments, forming a network beneath the surface. With a gloved hand, she carefully tried to trace one. It was surprisingly tough, almost fibrous. The hissing began again, louder this time, originating from all around her, a chorus of sibilant whispers that seemed to coil around her ears. It sounded less like wind and more like a collective sigh or a low, insistent chant. Ilara's blood ran cold. She straightened up slowly, her gaze sweeping across the greenhouse. Every leaf, every bloom, every tendril seemed to be subtly, almost imperceptibly, swaying towards her even without a breeze. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure. Panic started to set in. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting. She felt a prickling sensation on her ankles, a faint tugging. Looking down, she saw that the smaller ground cover plants, usually meek and contained, had begun to extend thin, almost invisible runners across the floor, reaching out for her shoes. She stumbled, her heart leaping into her throat. As she moved towards the exit, a large, exotic bloom she'd carefully nurtured, a plant with enormous bell-shaped flowers, seemed to turn its opening directly towards her. From its depths, a cloud of iridescent spores puffed out, catching the light. Ilara held her breath, instinctively recoiling. The spores drifted towards her, glittering like dust motes. She flung open the greenhouse door and burst out into the late morning sun, gasping for air, her lungs burning as if she'd been holding her breath for too long. The fresh air was a shock. She turned back, looking at the greenhouse. The glass panes, usually reflecting the sky, now seemed to shimmer with that faint, reddish glow emanating from within. The dense foliage inside looked darker, more ominous. As she stood there, shaken, her gaze fell upon a forgotten stone marker near the ancient oak tree at the edge of the garden. It was half buried, covered in ivy. She knelt, clearing away the overgrowth, and read the faded inscription. "Here lies Elias Thorne, rooted 1852. Elias Thorne. The name stirred a faint memory. She vaguely recalled reading something about the previous owner, a reclusive botanist who had vanished decades ago. But the dates, 1852, the property deed mentioned he died in 1890, and rooted, a strange choice of word for a tombstone. Suddenly, a wave of profound nausea washed over her. The sweet, cloying scent from the greenhouse now seemed to be coming from the very earth beneath her feet. She looked down at her hands, still dusty from digging. The soil seemed to shimmer with a faint reddish tint, and she could almost swear she felt a faint, pulsing warmth against her skin, as if something alive was buried beneath the very ground she stood on. The whispers in the leaves seemed to follow her, a low, constant murmur that now sounded less like conversation and more like a name, repeated endlessly, Elara, Elara, Elara. I've continued the story, building on the sensory details and introducing a new layer of mystery with the strange filaments, Elias Thorne's unusual tombstone, and the spores. The garden is becoming more actively menacing. Elara stumbled back from the stone marker, the chilling inscription "Rooted" echoing in her mind. Elias Thorne, a botanist, vanished, only to be rooted in 1852, yet died decades later. The timeline made no sense, but the implications were horrifying. The warmth, the reddish glow in the soil, the continuous sibilant whisper of her name, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. Elias Thorne was still here, absorbed, alive within the very earth of the garden, a part of its monstrous consciousness. She scrambled away from the oak tree, her breath ragged. She had to get out, but as she ran towards the dilapidated cottage, the garden itself seemed to resist. The path, usually clear, was now choked with an explosion of new growth. Vines snaked across the flagstones, impossibly thick overnight, and thorny bushes seemed to lean in, their branches weaving together, forming a thorny barricade. The sweet, cloying scent intensified, now almost nauseating, a thick, living perfume. The whispers grew louder, no longer just her name, but a chorus of indistinct voices, murmuring, beckoning. They seemed to emanate from every leaf, every petal. Elara pushed through a tangle of flowering shrubs, their blossoms brushing against her skin, leaving a strange, sticky residue. She felt a phantom tickle, a crawling sensation on her bare arms. When she looked down, tiny, nearly microscopic spines were embedded in her skin, radiating a faint, dull ache. She reached the cottage door, fumbling with the rusted lock. It jammed. Panic flared, cold and sharp. She tried again, desperately twisting the handle. The wood of the door itself seemed to swell, resisting her. From behind her, the garden pulsed with a newfound vigor. The greenhouse glass shimmered a vibrant, malevolent red. She glanced over her shoulder. The climbing rosebush, the one outside her bedroom window, had grown immensely, its thorny branches now completely obscuring the window, pressing against the glass. The dark red rosebuds, hundreds of them, all seemed to have opened, each revealing that unsettling, watchful eye at its center. They blinked in unison, 1,000 crimson eyes staring at her. "Let me in!" Ilara screamed, banging on the cottage door, her voice cracking with terror. A chillingly clear voice, a blend of 1,000 whispers, resonated from the garden, seemingly from the very air around her. It was deeper, more resonant than before, a voice that spoke without a mouth. "You are home, Ilara." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low, resonant rumble. Small cracks appeared in the cottage's foundation. The very structure seemed to groan, as if the garden was tightening its grip, slowly pulling the house into its embrace. The sweet, cloying scent now had a metallic undertone, like something fermenting, something consuming. Ilara felt a sudden, sharp pain in her leg. A thick, root-like tendril had erupted from the earth beneath her, wrapping tightly around her ankle. She cried out, tugging at it, but it held fast, incredibly strong. More tendrils, thick and ropey, began to snake out of the ground, inching towards her, some bristling with thorns, others slick and pale like underground worms. Her gaze fell on her open hand, still bearing the faint reddish shimmer from touching the soil. A single, delicate, almost translucent filament now protruded from the back of her palm, pulsating with the same dim, internal light she'd seen in the greenhouse soil. It was like a miniature organic wire, connecting her directly to the pulsing network beneath the earth. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a symphony of hungry sounds, growing louder, more distinct. The rustle of countless leaves, the snap of growing stems, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of something deep below, like a gigantic, slow-beating heart. And through it all, the collective voice of the garden, now sounding triumphant. "Join us, Ilara. Be rooted." The tendril tightened around Ilara's ankle, pulling with a strength that belied its plant-like appearance. Her shouts for help were swallowed by the escalating symphony of the garden, the rustling, the snapping, the deep, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the ground. The filament in her hand pulsed faster, radiating a strange warmth that spread up her arm, a sensation both alien and eerily comforting. Just as the first thorny vine coiled around her wrist, a familiar, exasperated voice cut through the clamor. "Ilara, what in the blooming blazes is going on here?" Liam. He stood at the edge of the garden, his jaw slack, eyes wide with disbelief as he took in the impossible, rampant growth. He'd come to check on her after her vague, increasingly frantic text. Seeing the bizarre, self-propagating barricade of plants, the trembling cottage, and Ilara caught in the tendrils. He knew his friend wasn't exaggerating. "Liam, help me!" Ilara screamed, pulling against the tightening tendril. The garden seemed to react to his presence, its growth accelerating. More thorny vines shot out, weaving around Ilara, forming a desperate cocoon of green and red. The 1,000 watchful eyes on the rosebuds blinked faster, a silent, menacing chorus. Liam, despite his shock, was a man of action. He grabbed a heavy spade he'd brought, intending to hack through the menacing vines. But as he stepped onto the path, the ground beneath him erupted. Thick, thorny roots, like enormous gnarled fingers, burst from the earth, reaching for his ankles. He leaped back, narrowly avoiding being ensnared. The garden's collective voice roared, no longer a whisper but a deep, resonant rumble that shook the air. "Intruder! Protect the bloom!" The force pulling Ilara was immense. She felt herself being dragged inexorably towards the nearest rosebush, towards the vibrant, unnervingly large blooms with their watchful eyes. The filament in her hand, however, now pulsed with a different rhythm, a faint, almost hypnotic glow. The warm ache in her arm spread, and a strange calm began to settle over her, overriding the terror. She could feel the faint thump, thump, thump in the earth, and it felt like a part of her own heartbeat. Liam, seeing the plants closing in on Ilara, knew he couldn't get close. His gaze fell on the old, neglected well near the cottage, its crumbling stones barely visible amidst the new growth. He remembered tales, whispered by old-timers in town, of the Thorn property, of strange rituals and vanished people, always tied to a central source. It was a desperate, unscientific thought, but he had to try something. He stumbled towards the well, dodging snapping vines and thorny tendrils that seemed to anticipate his movements. He found an old, rusted bucket nearby, still attached to a frayed rope. With a desperate heave, he flung the bucket into the well. It hit the surface with a dull plunk, and he began to crank the rusty mechanism, hoping for what? Water? Mud? As the bucket slowly ascended, dripping black, viscous, liquid, the garden's rage reached a fever pitch. The greenhouse glass shattered, showering the ground with shards. Giant blooms unfurled with violent snaps, their pollen-laden air now thick with a dizzying, sweet aroma that threatened to suffocate Ilara. The bucket emerged, overflowing with the same dark, shimmering liquid that had coated the filament in Ilara's hand. But mixed within it were dozens of small, glistening, reddish-black seeds. They pulsed with a faint internal light, like tiny, embryonic hearts. Liam, without thinking, flung the contents of the bucket into the heart of the garden, aiming for the most densely overgrown area where Ilara was slowly being absorbed. The black, viscous liquid, studded with the pulsing seeds, splattered across the vibrant foliage, coating the leaves and stems. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Where the liquid touched, the plants rotted, not withered, but decomposed, with impossible speed, turning from vibrant green to black, slimy decay in a matter of seconds. The cloying sweetness turned to a putrid stench of death. The rhythmic thrumming in the earth faltered, then died. The 1,000 watchful eyes on the rosebuds shriveled and closed. The tendrils holding Ilara went slack, releasing her. She collapsed onto the suddenly still, silent ground, gasping for breath, the reddish filament in her hand fading and retracting. Liam rushed to her, pulling her away from the rapidly decaying horrors. They ran, not looking back. The putrid smell of the dying garden, a foul companion. Months later, Ilara had fully recovered. She never spoke of the garden, not truly. Liam, however, visited the property occasionally. The cottage was gone, swallowed by the rapidly reclaiming wild. The greenhouse was a skeletal ruin of glass and rusted metal, choked with ordinary weeds. The entire area where the vibrant, monstrous plants had grown was now a barren, blackened patch of earth. Nothing growing there. It was as if the garden had consumed itself. But one day Liam noticed something. On the edge of the blackened earth, where the monstrous growth had started, a tiny, almost imperceptible sprout had emerged. It was a single delicate green shoot, unlike anything he recognized. He bent closer, and at its very tip, a tiny, dark, reddish bud was forming. It looked like a miniature, tightly closed eye. Liam stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that the well, the source of the garden's demonic life, hadn't contained water at all. It had contained the seeds. Seeds that, when exposed to the overwhelming, vibrant life force of a new botanist's passion and fertile soil, would awaken, consume, and spread. The garden wasn't demonic. It was a single, vast, living entity, endlessly reproducing, perpetually, waiting for a new host to cultivate its next terrifying bloom. And the possession wasn't of the plants themselves, but of the earth, which merely used the plants and anyone who tended them as its unwitting instruments for propagation. Elias Thorne had been rooted not by becoming a part of the garden, but by becoming its first seed pod. And Ilara, for a terrifying moment, had almost become its next. The true horror wasn't the demonic garden, but the parasitic intelligence within the earth, waiting for an unwitting hand to spread its offspring. Final, unsettling thought occurred to Liam as he backed away from the lone sprout. The parcel of land Ilara had bought, the neglected property on the outskirts of town, was bordered on one side by an old, unused country road, and on the other by acres of untouched, fertile wilderness stretching for miles. The well had simply contained the seeds of a new beginning, a new cycle of horror waiting to unfurl its insidious bloom upon an unsuspecting world. The demonic garden hadn't been defeated. It had merely relocated its heart.